Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning and tuning in if you're joining us and viewing on the webinar. The idea for this conversation, I think, for me started about a month ago, and it started thinking back to November 2019. And I guess it could be any month in 2019 would work, but November seems like a good place marker. And just thinking back to in my own life, how much planning and organizing I was doing with a certain kind of background latent assumption about how certain I was about the future and how the future was going to look and unfold. And as we all know, 2020 rolls around and reshifts that significantly. And the fascinating thing, as I've thought about it, is that in reality, life is not actually any more uncertain now than it was back at the end of 2019, but I'm so much more aware of how uncertain life is now, as opposed to the end of 2019, where I was just sort of plowing ahead and doing my own, working with all the assumptions I had about the future. And so it seems like an interesting time to just kind of pause and stop and think about how we work in an uncertain world, how we think in an uncertain world, how we teach in an uncertain world. And so I'm really thankful to the four of you for joining me in this conversation and kind of getting the ball rolling on a series of discussions to just unpack this, to see how uncertainty is showing up in our lives, how we're responding to it, how we see the people around us responding to it, and what we might have to learn from it. So thank you so much for jumping in. And maybe just simply, well, let me begin by doing a quick introduction here, just so everyone has an idea of who each other is. Dr. Melanie Ann Atkins is an expert on, I would say, all things education and mental health, coming out of Western University. James Chan is an advocate for civic participation, a real promoter of equitable urbanism. Jinal Shah is joining us from New York. She is the Vice President of Marketing at Feather, which is the furniture rental startup. And Sienna Jae Taylor is a community engagement specialist and strong advocate for equity and inclusion here in our community here in London. So I feel like, for me, I have this sense that I have a somewhat more kind of immediate or tacit idea about what uncertainty is, given the events of the last few months. But I would love to hear from you what you're thinking and experiencing, and how uncertainty is showing up in your world. So maybe, Sienna, could we start with you? And what's uncertainty looking like?
Yeah, sure. So I think for me, my personal and professional is really interconnected. And it's funny because at the end of 2019, I really jumped in. I called it jumping into the unknown, because I left my job with the purpose of sort of taking time to reflect and be intentional about the trajectory of my career. And I was ready to just dive back into the nonprofit sector, and suddenly COVID hit. And so I've been kind of sitting in this uncertainty for a while, but it was a bit of a struggle to then have the world be like, no, you're going to have to hold off a little bit longer. So something that I'm really seeing is this sort of, I kind of thinking of it as this pause and press, where the people in my world, as well as I think what I'm seeing within the nonprofit sector is there's this massive pause of, we can't move forward, or we don't want to move forward, or we don't think it's appropriate to move forward. But then in other regards, this massive press forward. So whether it's people in their personal lives thinking, well, now I have this time, so to speak, what am I going to do with this time? And for organizations looking at, what are their priorities in that moment, and how do we press forward? How do we be innovative? How do we be creative? So I think I'm seeing a really big shift. And I think two things can be true at the same time, where, people in this uncertainty are just stopping and kind of throwing their hands up in the air and saying, what can we do right now? But at the same time, there's people that are really, and organizations really, really pressing forward. And it's this weird, it's just this weird press and pause that I'm feeling.
The other thing that kind of struck me was related to, James, what you wrote in your blog around, perhaps people conflating risk and uncertainty. and often thinking those are the same things. But, you know, as I was thinking about this topic and even hearing Sienna, I think part of that is we also conflate uncertainty with control and influence. And I think that plays into the equation for all of us, whether it's in an individual or organizational level. I think part of that struggle and the tension that Sienna mentioned is, you know, that uncertainty, yes, but then the feeling of not being able to influence or shape your own kind of immediate future, having no control over events. And so, yeah, it's interesting, you know, like when you said, James, it's always been uncertain. We you know, we're no more or less able to predict the future than we were 4 or 5 months ago. But perhaps what you were feeling in November 2019 was that you had a certain element of control over where 2020 could go. There were certain things that you could influence, that you could kind of shape. And now all of those things are gone and out of all of our hands. So yeah, it's interesting, the point that you brought up, where there's actual discrete, distinct elements, but we kind of, on a regular day-to-day level, we kind of just lump them all into one category.
I think in the business world, so it's so fascinating to hear the nonprofit perspective. I think what happened with us, I work at a startup, and as soon as COVID hit, it almost kicked off this rational part of the brain, which is how do we survive? And it went from, it's like, we know there's uncertainty, but we need to be in survival mode. And the thing is, when you are in survival mode, there's a very distinct set of skills which I didn't even know I had. I think as human beings, we all just have them. Like how it just moves into that gear. And, you know, it was so interesting. The one thing I keep hearing in the business world from all the, you know, conversations, webinars, all the CEOs I've heard talk is COVID has sort of sped up decision making. It's made people so decisive. So decisions in an organization that would take months are now happening within days. And actual pivots, you know, actualizing, whether it's launching something new or creating a new service, like those that could take months are happening in weeks. And, you know, it's really interesting. It's very ironic because we are in uncertain times. And yet I feel like in this world that I'm part of, there's so much, we're acting with a lot of certainty. You know, we're making a lot of bets, we're making a lot of decisions because it's really just driven by, like, it's not even about thriving anymore, it's how do we survive. So I find that in a personal level, it's been very weird and confusing because, you know, it's like we're all in our little bubbles in some way. At least, you know, I am, and not stepping out from the home. So it's like we know something major is going on outside, but then in here we're in such survival mode and figuring out how do we keep the lights on in the business, that I think on a personal level, I wish I haven't had as much time to reflect, or that emotional bandwidth to spend on thinking about how, like, what about me? Like, how is it affecting me? So it's very confusing. I will say that.
Interesting, Jinal, that you say that in the business world, COVID has made people more decisive, because that hasn't been the case in higher education. You know, so there was a big decision, obviously, to move everything online. But, you know, in my circles of people, you know, that was the big decision. And then everything else was actually put on pause or postponed, or, you know, we'll get back to you, you know. And so it's really neat to see the contrast between, you know, what the survival mode looks like in the business world and what it might look like in the higher education sector, because I think with the higher education sector, the decision had to be made of what is education going to look like for our students. But anything else that didn't directly have to do with that particular decision actually did become postponed and held off. And actually, that's what I was struggling with at the beginning of this COVID thing, because I am an extremely black and white thinker. I love control over my environment. I love being able to predict what's going to happen. And so I found now that, you know, the pieces are coming together, and it's more like an acceptance where we are, you know, like I feel like in the higher education sector, it was a grieving process. And now we are approaching some kind of acceptance of, oh, okay, I guess it really is this way of dealing with things. And now let's make these decisions, right? And so I think that the trajectory has been quite interesting to observe, both in the sector and then in myself.
That comment about a grieving process is something that I found fascinating, and I've heard a few people personally and professionally or collectively describe it that way, which is really fascinating. And I think, I mean, I can kind of think back to, you know, February, March, and that kind of the ball dropped in early March, and that emotional process of, okay, this is, you know, the world I live in now. What's at the end of the grieving process though? Do we, is that what people mean when they talk about like the new normal? Is that the new normal is we, you know, grieve what we had before, or is the new normal like actually getting back to that normal? And yeah, I'm curious to hear your thoughts of that. When the grieving process is done, where is it that we exactly ended up?
I think that's something I've been thinking a lot about, being in the nonprofit sector. It's interesting hearing you talking about that survival piece, because when we think about the nonprofit sector and we think about the existence of these organizations, and when you hear from Imagine Canada that the nonprofit sector is at risk of losing $15.6 billion in revenue, you know, that does impact jobs, that does impact the organizations, but more than that, it impacts the communities and the people that these organizations are serving. And so I think when you talk about grieving in the nonprofit sector, it is very, very real, because you're talking about, you know, our most vulnerable people and their ability to thrive and engage in our communities. And so for me, I think I have gone through those processes, you know, of being angry and getting to that grieving process. But I think it really does depend on the sector, because I don't know. I think for the nonprofit sector, a lot of the issues that we have been talking about and the problems that we've been trying to solve for so long still exist. They're exasperated now, and they will continue to exist post-COVID. And so there's this opportunity. I think there's definitely a fear of what's going to happen with our organizations and the communities that we serve. But there's also this massive opportunity, because I think the rest of the community maybe is seeing that a little bit more clearly now. So there's this feeling of grieving, but I also don't know, for our sector at the end of it, I don't want it to feel like we've lost something. I want it to feel like our voices are now being heard loudly, clearly, and that action is happening. So loss in maybe certain policies and systems and structures, but in the work that's happening, I think there's an opportunity for the fear to kind of push for really positive change.
Yeah, I've been attending this series every Friday. Actually, today's the first day it's not happening. They're taking a pause. Called This Human Moment. And when you were talking, Sienna Jae, I was thinking about the what they call the trauma to renewal curve. And I think that what a lot of it, and so I'll read the titles of the different parts of it. So right here, right now, friendship with the unknown, reckoning with darkness. That was my favorite one, if you know me. Renewal, a path where there is no path, and then being whole humans at work. And so I think one of the biggest things, and maybe the only thing that I hope for at the end of this grieving process, James, is that we are actually different at work, but actually more ourselves at work. Mm-hmm. So I think, and Sienna Jae, I know exactly what you mean in terms of this being hopefully a point where things that were existing, structures that were existing and that created barriers for our most vulnerable, actually are permanently broken down because of a result of this. So that's where I'm hoping to end up after this grieving process.
Yeah, I don't know. I think in the business world, we're definitely going to see, and I'm, just like the nonprofit, a lot of companies aren't going to survive this. And I think that even some of the large ones, I believe JC Penney filed for bankruptcy, J. Crew, not to say that COVID directly impacted that, but it is definitely going to, if you're already suffering, if you are already diseased, this is definitely COVID's not going to help that situation. So there's definitely a reckoning that's happening in the business world. And, again, I think as a startup, we were lucky to have just completed what we call a Series B funding in December. Had that not been the case, it would have been a very different scenario. And you're seeing and you're hearing a lot of this news from San Francisco, from the Silicon Valley, of a lot of startups that maybe had one or two or a few months of runway, which, they've had to make very difficult decisions. So I think that is absolutely inevitable. We are all going to experience it across all sectors and in varying degrees. Uh, I guess like my exposure and my own, the world, that sort of the business world, that are sort of more white collar. That's the community I've been exposed to more, and to a certain extent, I think that people that will be impacted, I think they have better social systems and better resources maybe to tide them through this. I'm not speaking for all, but I would say, more than the communities being impacted by challenges in the nonprofit world. So I think that's inevitable, number one. I think the positive side, because that's all we can all look for right now, and I think that's what, if we have to come out of this, we have to focus on. The huge positive that I'm focusing on is this uncertainty has forced us to accept a lot of certainties. And the one thing I can tell you is, just online e-commerce shopping, right? For example, in the month of April, across all retail sites, they had 2 billion more visits than they did compared to the month of January. And what's that done really is, on two ends of the spectrum, right? So with human behavior, it's pushed even the ones who loved the experience of going into the store, it's pushed us because we've had no other option to go online. So even the ones who might have been resisting that behavior, it's given them no choice. And same thing with businesses. So even businesses that I've been hearing, even small business stories like, alcohol stores in certain neighborhoods, and even like the small businesses who not made the investment in their online businesses, they've been forced to do that because that's what their community is seeking them. That's what their loyal customers have been trying to sort of find them online. So I think like from that perspective, in a few where we see sort of this process emerging or taking us, I think we're going to see a huge behavior shift. It was already headed in that direction. I think COVID's definitely accelerated that. And I think the other thing I'm choosing to focus on I'm always a glass half full person. So this is how I cope, and this is my grieving mechanism. But there is a lot of creativity all around us. And, a friend of mine who runs this lovely company where she offers experiences with artists, she was telling me actually the artist community has never been busier, which blew my mind. And, I see even brands. So I saw yesterday or day before, I think, Vanity Fair, incredible magazine. And magazines are used to spending millions of dollars for photo shoots. They just shared a story that they put their June issue together by taking photographs over Zoom and with drones because of social distancing. I'm seeing like photographers embark on beautiful creative projects. And so I have to sort of focus on that. And even in my own case at Feather, we're a furniture rental company, and furniture photography is really expensive. And we've had to find ways to figure out the production with 20-person crew is just not possible. And who knows when that's going to be possible again. But business must go on, and we're in survival mode. So we figured out how to do that with a incredibly creative husband-wife team in San Francisco who just managed to do this all on their own. So it just is, I think, I'm seeing like creativity, resourcefulness, innovative thinking all around. And I'm seeing us sort of go back to the not basics, but sort of learn how to do more with less money and less budgets, which I hope is something we carry forward. I hope it's something we can take on with us.
Reminded me, I used to work in kind of the tech startup innovation world, and one of our programs actually had the tagline that creativity comes from constraints. And I think that's true. And I think I've heard, this notion, we use this phrase, think outside the box. Like we've used that for so long as just shorthand for, that's how you do brainstorming and innovative thinking. But, there's actually this notion of you need a box to really unlock and unleash people's creativities, because that's, you need to put some parameters and certain people will respond well to that. Not everybody, as you know, but I think you're bang on, and especially with the arts and culture world, I think they would say they've been doing more with less since the beginning of time. There's probably a lot to learn from that sector. Yeah, but it all goes back, it was a really good question, James, about, thinking about it in that way, or what's at the end of that process. And I was thinking about it the whole time, and I feel like, it's probably the same as before, where everybody will handle it differently, everybody will experience it differently. And so I think some people will come to some sort of acceptance stage. The point about the new normal and being pushed in directions that they wouldn't have been pushed in, whether it's, suddenly converting to online shopping. I'm thinking, the return to offices, if there's certain companies that are still kind of, not doing the permanently work from home thing, but, there will be people who, regardless of their opinions and preferences, will just have to go with it, right? Because they have no choice. And so there's this kind of sense of like, it is what it is, this is the new normal now, we will have to deal with it. I may complain along the way, I may, struggle and but it's happening. And then I think there will be other people who won't accept that, won't just kind of be there and be like, yep, tell me what to do and I'll do it. And they will seek to kind of impose their preferences, in a good or bad way. And that could be everything from people protesting lockdowns and masks, all the way to people advocating for a better social safety net, right? But that's being driven by the same thing, which is like, I'm not satisfied with what's being presented to me, and I'm going to try to do something about it. And then, and others still will try to, have that kind of creativity moment or moments, and really kind of make the most of the situation. And again, it could be in a bunch of different ways, but yeah, it's just interesting. And again, you could argue that this is just normal human nature, how we respond and deal with any sort of life event, but this idea of it being accelerated or kind of concentrated in one shorter period of time is an interesting kind of thing to see.
So when I hear people often talk about like, okay, the new normal or the back to normal, part of me wonders that for some of us, when we use that term, like what we're saying is I'm wondering, I'll just say this about myself, I'm thinking, okay, what I want is to go back to predictability, right? Like normal was November 2019, where as flawed as it was that I thought I could imagine what the future looked like, it gave me a certain sense of security, fabricated security, 100% not real, but it gave me a sense of security for moving forward. And I think a caveat that I'm struggling with working through is for many people, going back to normal or going back to a sense of predictability is also going back to something that was a lot more survivable. So I'm thinking about like the migrant agricultural workers around the planet, the number of day laborers there are around the planet, like that sense of rhythm and routine, and being able to say, okay, I'm pretty certain I know what's coming up next week is how you survive. And this right now is not survivable. And that's, I think, thinking about the difference between uncertainty on one hand and crisis on another hand, I think is probably helpful to disentangle. And that's another thought project I'm working through. But the question I'd love to throw to you is, when we go to whatever normal is, does that require us to assume that ability to predict the future, to assume that kind of we see what's coming, that we know what's coming? Or do we, as a result of this experience and as a result of this pandemic, can we have like kind of an asterisk around our future plans that we'll be cognizant of? Or do you think we'll just eventually kind of slide back into assuming that the future is more certain than it obviously is, given our experience? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I was in a webinar recently, and it was specifically focused around nonprofit communications, but what I took away from it I thought was very beneficial for all areas of life. And they were talking about how, how beneficial it could be to have your sort of risk management team, or not risk management team, but your crisis team. So who is making the decisions right now in the midst of a crisis, while simultaneously you have another team who's planning for the future. And I thought that was so brilliant. And how can I apply that in my own life? And how could organizations, nonprofit organizations, apply that sort of across the board? This idea of having multiple plans. And I remember reading a book on original thinkers, and they were talking about, they were exploring what makes something original and successful. And we always have this idea that if something is going to be really awesome and you're going to make something happen, whether it's from an individual or an organization, that you just throw caution to the wind, you zone in, and you just drive forward. And for some, that's what works and that makes it happen. But I think the reality of COVID is that, you can throw caution to the wind and you can drive forward, but any number of things can come up, anything can happen. And I think that it allows us to explore our creativity. It allows us to explore different paths if we have our plan A, our plan B, our plan C, for lack of a better word, for ourselves as individuals as well as organizations. Instead of coming up, this is our strategic plan, let's say, and this is how we're going to get there, thinking, well, if we can't get there, what are the barriers we're going to come up against, and how are we going to navigate those? I think it's such a great exercise for yourself individually as well as a team to think about all the possible options, and then to find like Jinal was saying, finding that the silver lining or the positive in each option. This route could be good because of this route could be good because of this. I think from a very sort of tangible and logical approach, that's something that I see kind of coming out of this, and accepting that we may not find that predictability. And I think that might be frightening for some, but I think that people have become very comfortable with the predictability. And I think when that was shaken up, that's what made people realize, that's when people really started to recognize how interconnected we all are as humans, as organizations, as sectors, because that predictability was gone and the only thing we could lean on was our support for one another. And so as uncomfortable and icky as that might be for some people, I think coming to terms with the fact that life and work is not predictable is probably what will, push us past those walls we've been coming up against in the past.
I think I love this conversation on predictability, because that is one word we talk about all the time in our, we have, as a team, our leadership team meetings were maybe once every 2 weeks before. Now we're meeting twice a week, because as a business, we're trying to figure it out. How do we get to that predictability? How do we get to us? And what does that even look like? What does that even mean? How does that impact our cash flow? So it's so interesting from that one perspective. That's how we are thinking about. And I think on a personal level too, I am craving some predictability. On a personal level, like my parents live in India, and just the idea of or not knowing when do I get to see them again, or when can I even travel there? When can I get them here? I try not to go spiral down like that piece, because that's as immigrants, we all have at least, there's this added sense of you're keeping tabs on what's happening in 2 different places and 2 different time zones. So that's been, it's the only way I have found to deal with it is to build predictability in my routine, to build predictability where I can. So I find this conversation really interesting, because I think that I don't think life has ever been predictable, but I think it's human nature where we need those frameworks, those structures, that 9 to 5, this is lunchtime, this is dinner time. I think we've probably created that because it offers us a sense of stability, a sense of security. And I think that, even a small example. So one thing I've been doing, because I have a little dog, and, we've been very, observant of the social distancing rules, but every evening we do step out when we can to the park, and it was quiet the first 2 months, and absolutely the only people you see are other people with dogs. And the minute sort of the news started looking more optimistic here in New York, and the weather started getting better, it's almost like it's like the crowds were out. You started seeing groups of 8 or 9 or 10, and with very flimsy masks on, but sitting very close to each other. And suddenly the park was full. And, we were walking back, and, some of these restaurants have opened up, and they're offering curbside alcohol and drinks. And it was like a block party. And so I guess like where I'm taking us with this is I think that people are craving this predictability. They want to get back so quickly to the world they knew. And I think in some ways we all want shorter memories of this period that we've gone through. Some will have them, unfortunately, because maybe we've not been directly impacted. You know, maybe we don't have frontline workers who are like 1 degree removed from us, or anyone that's you know, we've lost 1 degree removed from us. And even for the ones who may have, I can't speak for them, but I would imagine they would want to see certain semblance of the world they knew. So I struggle a lot with this. I think we will want to have a shorter term memory about this, but I think our behaviors and the imprint of this on us is going to be for a long time. Someone mentioned to me, I think it's like, you know, after the Great Depression, there was a whole generation of grandparents who never trusted the banks and kept money in their mattresses, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think we're going to have those deep imprints. I don't know what they're going to be, but then life is going to go on. That's my sort of, that's all the signals I'm seeing are sort of pointing me towards that.
So Jinal, I want to speak to some of your points because I really like when you said, I am craving some predictability, and that was my life. I remember even with my parents, you know, they would call me during, you know, work hours, and I'd say, what are you doing? This is my work time, you know, and I live at home by myself. They're like, what do you mean? It doesn't matter, you know. Anyway, so I feel you on that. But there are a few points I wanted to pick up on. So my first, going back to James, to your original question, I don't want to say that, I wrote down here, we won't know that we're back to normal until normal is in the rearview mirror. We won't even know. And I think that that's kind of where I'm going with my theme of what I'm going to offer to this conversation, because I think that our new normal, for those of us who are able to adapt and be agile during this time, is to be more accepting of the unpredictability of life. And I know for me, that has been my journey, because that is not how I like to operate. But I only started to see a little bit of joy when I was able to get there, to be more mindful about living in the present versus finding my joy from planning my future, which is what I used to be and how I kind of grew up thinking it was right. And then you're talking about, you know, short memories. And I thought, oh, yeah, I know what you mean there. And then, you know, generations past and how they dealt with trauma. And one thing that I thought about when you were saying that, Jinal, was that there is post-traumatic stress, right, that we all know about, but there's also post-traumatic growth. And one thing that I had to do when I went into a rut after being super happy to be working at home alone, because I'm an introvert and I love it, not being interrupted in my day, was to actually stop trying to find joy. Sounds really weird, right? I switched it. I started looking for meaning in my experiences. And that's what they tell us about the process of post-traumatic growth. So is to actually not have that short-term memory about really negative experiences, but to feel them deeply, like disturbingly deeply, and then to find meaning through that experience of feeling those emotions and that trauma really deeply. And so one thing that I always say to graduate students is, when you're dealing with stress, right, there's kind of 3 responses. So there's avoid, which is when you change the stressor, which is hard for some of us right now, right? There is adapt, which is what all those like motivational speakers tell us, like change yourself, you can't change the situation. But there's also anticipate. And for a lot of us who have been successful in life, especially in post-secondary, it's because we were able to anticipate things that would come along in the future. And we'd say, haha, not this time, because we've got to plan this time. But the fact is that through something like COVID, I have found that it's almost impossible to anticipate. So we're actually working with 1/3 less of what we usually work with to have us achieve success. And so I think the new normal will be rotating between avoiding the stressor and adapting ourselves, and having that be new normal, and not relying on that third mechanism of being able to anticipate or predict what's going to happen in the future in order for us to feel like we're okay.
I like how both of your comments, Melanie and Jinal, ask inherently the question, how do we live sustainably in an unpredictable world, right? So once we've come to that, you get to the grieving, you do like, okay, I realized the world was not as like certain as I thought it was. Okay, that hurts. We'll work through that. And then, okay, if instead of denying that, I accept that, I even internalize it, how then do I thrive in this world, which is patently, the only thing that's predictable about it is that it's unpredictable. And I think phrasing the question that way is so helpful, because it's responsive, adaptive, resilient, it's forward-looking. Yeah, anyone else want to build on that?
Yeah, I was thinking about something Jinal said about, craving the predictability and the rules and the structures. And my thought immediately was, I remember taking my 4-year-old niece to her first day of school, and they were supposed to line up, and all the kids are lining up in their straight line, and my niece is spinning around a pole. And I thought to myself, I was like, you get it, girl, do your thing. Why do you need to stand in the straight line? And so I'm thinking, and about what Melanie's saying as well, is, about the anticipation is what allows people to succeed. When we understand the structures, we understand what, how to get from A to B to C, that's how we achieve success. So for me, as someone who doesn't necessarily like being in that box, and I want my niece to spin her way into the school, I see there's this shift in community where now, some people are feeling unsettled in this, but now suddenly is there this opening for people who have come up with barriers constantly to suddenly find their way to success. And I think, you mentioned being an introvert as well. We're seeing this happen where there's different personality types. And I imagine you see this intensely within the school systems. There are different personality types. There are different ways of learning. There are different ways. There's different environments that allow people to succeed. And we've gone from one, which realistically was very rigid and structured, to almost the complete opposite, where now, there's just this open space to a certain degree, and you have to figure out how to succeed in that space. And for some people, they're thriving in it. They're like, you know what, this has forced me out of that environment that I was not good in, and I have the freedom and the space to be creative, to explore, to reconsider my future. So it's interesting. And so I think we need to kind of find that balance going forward of how do we create communities where everybody can engage and succeed in ways that make sense for them. Because I think we've done a bit of a flip-flop, plus the added stress of COVID. So yeah, that was just, something I was thinking about.
I agree with that. And I really liked what you guys said. I do think, however, without disagreeing, this is my sort of prediction, that we have built up a certain system around us, whether it's in business or nonprofits or higher ed. And that dominant system does run on predictability and allowing its participants to anticipate what's coming up, right? And so even if it's not 100% linear fashion, like, I think people are used to having that. I think that you mentioned that, James, that even if we deep down, we know we can't ever achieve full predictability, that's not what we're really after. What we're really after is the semblance and the feeling of predictability. And as long as we feel it the same way everybody else feels it in the system, that's good enough for us. And so I do think that part of the going back to normal, or the whatever comes after this, is that dominant system trying to reassert itself and trying to get back to that linear, predictable fashion, right? And especially, you might be able to speak to this better than I, but I feel like that the driving force of that will be the business sector. It will be the economy, right? Capital E economy, because it runs on predictability. And I think governments, higher central authorities, everything from public health to central banks to any sort of large public institution, will be doing their best in this recovery period to get us back there. And so, Sienna, for everybody else in the system who've either been enjoying this period or people who are trying to shift the system, right? It will remain an uphill battle. The odds are still stacked against our favor.
Yeah. James, you're making me think. It's a very half-baked thought, but I think I'd be remiss if I didn't share this. The one thing as you're saying, it occurred to me is, I wonder, I think what predictability, or at least operating in that dominant, system, as I like that better, how you described it, it's given us some skills, right? I feel like we know how to critically assess something, even something that might be going wrong. I look at sort of the CDC and or at least here, Dr. Anthony Fauci, and, the way he's relying on he's relying on what's happened in the past to help us, navigate through what's happening now. So I think there is a lot of value also to, I guess, like it's these are so invisible now, these skills, but we've all sort of been, I think we all have that mental wherewithal to at least sort through and think through how might we actually deal with this. It's like we are, I'm it's very half-baked, but I wonder if, like, this dominant system that we've all been surviving in or thriving in, it's prepared us to deal with this uncertainty. It's in a very weird sort of blurring and mixing of the two ends of that spectrum.
Before COVID, there was a disconnect between human beings. And so those systems that stood rugged and dominant were able to move forward without very much pushback. And now, we've had these nonprofit organizations who've been doing this work for a very, very long time. The advocates and the activists have been pushing for this. Now, all of a sudden, we have the rest of the community who may not have understood, who may not have been aware. All of a sudden, they're like, wait a second, what I do impacts you. And not just from a nonprofit sector, but if you look at the way people are supporting small business, the way that people understand how their action impacts the entire healthcare system, impacts the economic system. So people are aware of these interconnections. And so I think this is where there's this opportunity to hold on to that, to make sure people remember that interconnection. And then as we move forward, I think that the odds may be stacked against us, but I think I'm trying to find a word that does not associate with violence, but the group of people, the group of humans that will push back against this is going to be bigger. I really do believe that. And I think that nonprofit organizations, there's a role that they have to step into, and I believe quickly. And that's the role of saying, yes, COVID is happening. Yes, healthcare matters. And yes, we still matter. Our work that we're doing right now, you may not feel like it's directly related to the crisis, but it matters now, and it will matter more going forward. So we need to be loud. We need to be at the tables. We need to push. And I think that the rest of the community will rally behind that, because I'm seeing it happen. And so we just need to keep the momentum going.
Yeah, I really like this idea of the memory and the short memory and the memory keepers, because I absolutely agree. The window for change is now, and we've already seen it. There's lots of people who have already, tons of op-eds and pundits who are saying, like, look at how fast government can move when it really wants to, right? Like, Jinal, earlier on when you said, oh, like this uncertainty has pushed, really quick decision making in the business sector, that I have no doubt believing. What is more hard, difficult to believe is how quickly government is in Canada here. I can't speak for the US side, but the Canadian federal government has moved super quickly on all kinds of things that many people would never have thought they would ever entertain, right? So definitely the window for kind of disruptive change and shifting these systems is now. The odds are still stacked, but it is a prime kind of opportunity. But I really like that reframing of, because I think there's, here in Ontario, you might have heard there's going to be a kind of a provincial commission on how the long-term care system has performed and held up, and they're looking at mistakes made and what we could have done better. But a lot of these kind of exercises have this framing of, like, not quite a finger pointing exercise, but some kind of investigative, mindset of, like, let's look at what went wrong and let's figure out how we can prevent it from happening again. But I think this framing of, like, let's make sure this is in our memories and we don't forget, we don't just move on, right, and snap back to, oh, hey, we can go to the parks again. So, like, it doesn't matter about the 2 months we couldn't do all those things. Now that we have this, freedom again, everything's fine. There's something there to this keeping this institutional memory going. And I think it works. There's lots of examples from the past. Just this week, I saw, the Walkerton crisis was in the news again. Jinal, the Walkerton was a small town decades ago where, because of lapses and lack of investment from government funding, a small town had its water supply contaminated with E. coli and 8 people died. And that sparked a whole kind of decades-long, public commission, inquiry, all this kind of stuff. But, like, Walkerton still lives on in people's memories as just shorthand for, like, let's not take our eye off the ball when it comes to public safety. And that is a very powerful thing. And so what would need to happen for this kind of pandemic to make sure that we carry on these lessons and these memories, 2 decades from now?
I think the one I read in New York Times an article recently. It's so, our systems, at least the buildings here in New York, they haven't been designed to not be used for 2 months, 3 months at a go. And there's a real danger that they've sort of actually pointed out that there's bacteria that's been, collecting in the vents, in the water systems, because the water hasn't been running in the pipes. And they call it, what is it, the Legionella disease? I probably
Legionnaires, yeah.
Yes, Legionnaires. That's it. And it's just like we just don't know like what's it going to be like when the economy, when people start coming back, and then if you start turning back these buildings and these on. So I think what's really, I think like our whole, like the job of the memory keepers is far from over right now. And I think it's going to, every sector will have sort of these, what happens when you turn something off or switch to a different modality, and then what happens when you bring those modalities together. So I love this sort of the memory keepers and how we have to actually fight this short-term memory.
Leslie, why don't I add a question in the Q&A about this whole idea of memory keepers, and can leadership be focused on developing community, or maybe I could say even collective agreement on those different ways forward? And I think the idea of how do we, how do you simultaneously then hold memory and think forward? James, I love your example about Walkerton, because that's an incident that kind of in our in our province anyway had a little bit of a never again kind of concept around it. It was like, well, we can't have municipal water systems that kill people. Like, that really should not be a thing that happens. And then, I mean, it's interesting to juxtapose. I think that was 20 years ago or so. And so how has that memory been kept alive? How has it informed future decisions or not? And intergenerationally, what does that mean? Did we learn what we needed to learn from the 1930s and 40s? Now, how has that played out?
Yeah, what did we learn is interesting, right? Because the only reason that Walkerton came up in the news and I read about it was the fact that there were memory keepers in that community who were pointing out that the government decisions happening now, in fact, are not keeping the lessons from that crisis years ago, right? They were basically sounding the alarm that it said, all these different proposals and bills and stuff that have been either recently passed or proposed is actually turning back some of the protections that have been put into place. So we went through that period of grief and loss, right? The never again, the inquiry, the investigation, and then we implemented a series of preventative measures, stronger measures, more robust regulation to ensure that it doesn't happen again. And I think it's just interesting that for in the context of our conversation, that there are memory keepers who have not taken their eye off the ball, right? They have been monitoring. They have been still acting in this kind of watchdog capacity, and now are sounding the alarm to say, hey, 2 decades on, everybody else might have forgotten, but we in Washington sure haven't. And we are now, kind of telling you that what you're trying to do, what you're proposing, will create another similar crisis. And so, to Leslie's question about community agreement, I think Washington was perhaps a very simplistic example because it was such a clear and easy to understand what went wrong and what we need to do to not have that happen again, right? And when it comes to this current circumstance, it's a little less clear. There's way more finger pointing. There's more stakeholders. It's a global thing. We're in an age of misinformation where everybody kind of believes something different. Nobody really knows who to listen to. So it may be more difficult to come to that kind of community agreement or collective agreement moving forward, because to move forward, you need to kind of all agree on what went wrong and what we need to do to, what are we trying to prevent from happening again? Can we, or, what do we prioritize most? Is it health and well-being? Is it restarting the economy? Is it, protecting our national supply chain? Like, there's so many different priorities that can come out of it. So I do wonder if we will have the same sort of crystal clear sense of collective solidarity on where to go next. that again might be another prediction.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest struggles that we've had is that the leaders that are making decisions, or those with power that are making decisions, are often looking at issues in isolation, or they're looking at, even when we look at the reopening of the province, it's happening, they're looking at areas in isolation instead of understanding the holistic perspective of how all of these things are interconnected. And I think part of that is bringing those experts to the table, and memory keepers being the experts. I think something that we need to see happening going forward, especially at, quote unquote leadership level, is redefining what it means to be an expert, and redefining that quickly. And, a perfect example is looking at how much the nonprofit sector has had to fight to be at the table and to be part of the conversations happening right now, to be included. And so I think that at a leadership level, there needs to be major shifts happening. And so to Leslie's question too about, a way forward that's different from the past, I think that is a key piece, is really redefining what it means to be an expert, including those memory keepers, as well as those people with lived experience, and having people at the quote unquote table that can speak to different areas, so that when decisions are made, they're made from a holistic perspective, not just looking at healthcare or just looking at economy, or just, these things are all interconnected.
And I cannot agree more with what you've said. I think that if anything, what we've all experienced is how interconnected all our worlds are. And even on a very personal level, we're all working from home now. And this insane blurring of like work life, private life that's happened. And I think it's built more empathy. I hope it has built more empathy on all ends. But I do agree with you. And I think decision making amongst people of power is still very much happening in silos. And I think that even though we've seen how the economy has shown that we are all reliant on each other and we need all aspects of the economy to be humming, I do think that there could be more of this happening. Exactly. I think, James, what's wonderful about what you've done is, I'm sure we've been a part of a lot of different webinars, but the fact that it's all these different perspectives here, it's not just from the business world or the nonprofit world or the education world or community civic development. I think that is what needs to be happening at all levels and more of. And I think that is the answer towards getting a leadership and a set of behaviors that are taking into account the good of what we've had, but then also taking account the good that's come out of this now.
So being cognizant and respectful of everyone's time, I'm wondering if I could ask you just to kind of give what your takeaway, I guess, from this conversation is, and I'll give you a second to think about that, and I'll share mine. There's, I think, a blending of the topic converges what we've discussed for me in this idea of one of the roles of memory keepers is to remind us and to keep us cognizant of the unpredictability of our world. So maybe to come back to the Walkerton example, just as an illustration, the memory keepers of Walkerton remind us that assuming that municipal water systems are just going to work fine because they've always worked fine is incorrect. You have to anticipate, you have to think about various scenarios. You need to invest, and it's not a given. And having memory keepers who remind us that it's not a given is such an interesting way that the past can inform the future. And so that's, thank you all for this conversation. That's something I definitely want to wrestle through and think more about. So about yourself, any final words before we let everyone get back to work?
I think you asked about a takeaway. I think for me, the takeaway is that this uncertainty or this unpredictability means that the possibilities for the future are endless. And we can't assume that that all the systems that we currently have in place need to be saved. And because we have that uncertainty, because we have that openness, we can make really positive change. And I think that's a takeaway for me, and I hope it's a takeaway for other people that get a chance to listen to this conversation, that possibilities really are endless.
And if I can build on that, I had a similar thought where, you can say, we talked a lot about how, life really is unpredictable and we can't presume to know exactly what's going to happen. But at the same time, also keeping the truth that we have the ability to make decisions and influence the future. And those two things are also true. And so to Sienna's point about making change, and even things as people try to grapple with, how our economy, recovers and things like that, everything that is present in our systems and our structures were as a result of decisions made in the past. They didn't just happen. The economy just didn't happen this way. Our social safety nets, our structures, our silos, our government policies, all of them are based on decisions by human beings. And that's something that is within our control and influence. So to hold those kind of two truths that, life is unpredictable, but at the same time, you can kind of do something about it.
I plus one everything James and Sienna said. I think what I would add is, we are all developing a new muscle memory. Maybe we always had it, but it's coming to the forefront on how to be more creative, resourceful, how to think more holistically and not just be part of our worlds. And I hope that's something we keep, that's something we hold on to in the new world. And that's something we take with us as we recover and as we are on a path towards rebuilding. So. And thank you, James, for bringing us together.
Thank you so much, everyone, for taking a random hour out of a Friday morning to talk about how much we don't know. I mean, amazing. So, and thank you to everyone who joined us on the live webinar as well. Thanks for having us live maybe in the corner of your screen for a little while. So our next discussion in this series will actually be next Wednesday. So that's May 27th. And that will be noon to 1 Eastern time. So not only can we live in a corner of your screen, you can eat lunch while you watch us contemplate. So thank you so much, Melanie, Sienna, James, and Jinal. Thank you so much for bringing not just yourselves and your reflections and your experiences, but the different positions that you kind of occupy in our civic, economic world to bear on this conversation. It's really, really valuable to be kind of talking at these kind of four levels all at the same time. So thank you so much, everyone. Have a lovely day.
Thank you. Bye, guys.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, James.
Thank you.